hard. I will say that in losing my son, it's been 9 years ago now, almost instantly, 4 days later, like in preparation for the funeral, I just felt this very strong need to do something about it. Like, how did this happen? We need to understand how it happened and make sure it doesn't happen to anybody else. And so I had been an advocate in Jefferson County, Colorado, which is the western suburbs of Denver, for about 15 years at the point when Patrick passed away. And I had been one of those sort of typical boomer helicoptery moms who, was part of the advocacy group and advocated for geographic equity. We were having to drive kids to middle school like 20 minutes, which here in the suburbs is pretty far, and advocating for a high school program, kind of all based on his needs, and things were happening, but not quite in time for him. And so, this is really the culmination of my own journey in trying to find some meaning and share what I've learned with others. After Patrick passed away, it took about 2 years before I was ready to really go back and create a case study about his life as a gifted, twice exceptional child here in Jefferson County. And I did that and presented at our local Colorado Association chapter. People appreciated that, but somebody said, you really should consider SENG. That's really what it's all about. And so my first SENG presentation was in Denver, I think in 2014. And what I've done until today is just tell the case study about Patrick. But once I knew that I could tell the story without ending up being in a puddle on the floor, I reached out to Tracy Cross at William and Mary College. And I was in possession of 20 pages of instant messaging chat that showed exactly how things went down the night that my son completed suicide. And I thought that might be interesting to their research. And so he accepted the case study, and William and Mary spent almost 6 years conducting a psychological autopsy on Patrick. So that's my background and why I'm here. And it really is full circle, because they just published in January of 2020. And so this is the first time I've told this story, but with the benefit of 5 PhDs brains on it, not just my own mom brain. Okay, let's see, next slide, I'll push it this way. So these are just links. My handout, I will get it to the powers that be at SENG, but you can also get it at patrickstroutfoundation.org/presentation-handouts. And you'll see that there it's available for download. I've been blogging since about 2015 or so. And none of it's academic. It's kind of more personal and just sort of remembering the things that I've learned from him and his friends. And then there's the link to the psychological autopsy. I did find yesterday in a Google search that if you just put in the title of it, which is psychological autopsy of a twice exceptional gifted student, you can get a draft version on the William and Mary site as well. It's a little harder to read, but it meets the purpose. And I would also really want to acknowledge the incredible work of Tracy and Jennifer Cross. Tracy's been doing work around suicide in the gifted population for about 30 years. Many who know the sort of history of SENG know that he was the academic who did the psychological autopsy on Reed Ball when he passed away in 1994, I think. Actually didn't conduct the autopsy for a while because these things take time. And this is just super important work. There only have been 5 of these academic PAs done, and Tracy's done 4 of the 5, and he sat on the dissertation committee for the doctoral student who did the other one, the 5th. 4 of the 5 are on males, young males generally, and one was on a young girl. And I've heard Tracy talk about this study a couple of times, and at this point he calls it their best work to date. They're improving the process that they use. And just a little bit of information, Tracy said they spent at least 1,000 hours in research and study and writing and validating among a team of 5. And they interviewed my husband and I and Patrick's brother. They interviewed 4 or 5 of his friends. They interviewed teachers and guidance counselors. And I was the person on the other side that, arranged that. So they really try to get a 360 view of the person that they're doing these autopsies on. And I will say they called him Daniel. So when you read the study, it doesn't call him Patrick, and that's for institutional research purposes. But Tracy has actually honored me. I had dinner with them in February, right before the pandemic hit. He happened to be in Denver, and he asked me if I wanted him to call him Patrick when he talked about this study, and I said yes. So you'll see in writing, it's Daniel, but I hope to be really transparent because I think it's important that I, as a mom, reflected and documented what I was seeing as in my child, and now we can connect the dots with what the academics see. And it's my hope that that will be powerful in the industry. The other thing I think it's important to say is that they do consider him twice exceptional. He had an attention deficit disorder diagnosis. He was not hyperactive at all, but he was one of those kids that could be looking at you and thinking about Disney World. And so Patrick's or Daniel's is the only PA that's on a twice exceptional student. And I think that was one of the draws of Dr. Cross, the Doctor's Cross. So I'm going to start with, the other thing I will say is that Tracy Cross actually did a presentation for SENG on the 1st of July that was around understanding suicidal behavior in an attempt to, keep kids from completing suicide. So we're obviously on the same page. So I have taken some of the ideas that he presented there exactly the way he did, because I think it's important that we be really clear about this. And so it starts with the language. And so these definitions are from Scheidman, who Dr. Cross says really influenced his thinking about suicidal behavior, but it's just important to understand the language. So ideation is fairly common and most people don't act on it, sort of musing about what would it be like to just be gone. Attempts are direct efforts to end your life, and completions obviously are successful attempts. And Patrick completed, as far as we know, on the very first attempt, which is the scariest thing. The prevalence rates have increased 35% between 1999 and 2018. That went from 10.5 per 100,000 to 14.2 per 100,000. And the research is kind of all over the place here, but the number that Tracy uses is that they suggest that there are an average of 3.7 attempts to completion. And like I said, as far as we know with Patrick, he was talking about it, but never really did anything until the night he completed. And this is actually an area where Tracy's gut feeling is that gifted kids are different and more at risk because they're more likely to complete suicide on, a first attempt or second attempt because they're smart and they figure out how to do it. This is just a shout out to my boy. I think it's important to, sort of see the person and understand the magnitude of loss. And the focus of my prior presentations has been on school and how school did or didn't support him. As I said, I'm in Jefferson County, Colorado, which is, it's suburbs. It's fairly well funded, though Colorado is terribly funded in general. And we did have some gifted programming, but it was always kind of developing as Patrick needed it. Or if it wasn't there, I was part of the parent group that was advocating to get it, but it never quite fit his needs. So the majority of my presentation sort of focuses on sort of 7 to 18 or so. And he was 18 when he passed away. So again, just to kind of level set, he was a firstborn child, very much wanted, and he was just delightful. He was small. He was like 6.5 pounds at birth. And I was a working mom, so I went back to work after my 8-week maternity leave. And one of the things I've always said is the mom of gifted kids is you don't know that they're different. You only know what you know about your kid. He was just delightful. He had these bright blue eyes, and he was, smart. He wasn't super verbal early on, like he didn't do half sentences or anything, but his first sentence was before he was 1.5, and it was, "No home, mommy, more lights, please," when I was pointing out Christmas lights driving home from daycare one day. So like he just knocked me over with a full sentence with please at the end. So he was always a bit of he was what he was, and I didn't really question it until we hit school. I've found that sort of really understanding the over-excitabilities really helps with these gifted kids. And obviously, if you're here, you probably understand these. But I think when you look at suicide risk, the intensity around some of these over-excitabilities really can't be overstated. In Patrick's case, he was highly emotional. Imaginational, obviously intellectual. The only thing he really wasn't too much was the psychomotor. He was sensual. He was one of those kids that had a certain kind of Hanes sock, and anything else wasn't going to work. And his ADD reflected itself where, I would say, okay, come on, get ready for school, in second grade or whatever. And I'd come into his room and find him picking his socks, looking out the window. I'm like, what are you doing? He's like, I don't know what I'm doing. So I just, it's important to recognize those intensities and look for strategies to help them manage, I think, because that way things don't get out of control. We had a second child, Brendan. He's 4.5 years younger. They were in multi-age classes, and I really came to understand sort of the magic of that push-pull of olders and youngers. And we were just sort of a normal suburban family. My kids are all 4.5 years apart. In 2001, we adopted Emily from China. Patrick was 9.5 when we took that trip. And he was tremendously immersed in China and in caring for the babies. You can kind of see in some of these pictures. He also just fell in love with the culture, and he was an experiential learner for sure, and that showed itself in that China trip. He also just loved his baby sister. From the moment they met, he was just super affectionate, and they just had this koala hug thing that they did. And when I usually talk about Patrick, I go through each year of school and I talk about all the medications and all those things. I will point you to the handout. The 4th or 5th slide is actually the timeline of his life from the psychological autopsy, and that does address the medications at the bottom. But basically, he would be 28. So in first grade, when we were hit with he has attention deficit disorder first. Of course, they acknowledged that before the giftedness. He was on Ritalin. We had a trial on Adderall, kind of landed on Strattera, and then he took himself off in middle school. So I don't go into all of that. I will say that the school system did not meet his needs, that we didn't have early testing. His twice exceptionality made him look kind of average, to a typical kindergarten teacher and a typical first grade teacher. It wasn't until, people tapped me on the shoulder and said, you need to get this kid tested, that we really had a sense that the giftedness was probably more prevalent than that attention deficit disorder. So this just kind of summarizes some of the things that were really important about Patrick. He had a tremendous interest in the Civil War, and particularly the Confederacy. and we had the benefit of having met the gentleman who plays Robert E. Lee at some of the reenactments, and he conscripted Patrick into the Confederate Army when he was about 11. Best day of his life. This center picture here was actually Patrick's best friend, Evan, and Patrick and Emily at the Renaissance Festival here. And the bottom picture with him holding the guns haunts me a little bit. That's my cousin. And again, that same summer, that same trip, we were visiting my cousin who had all kinds of really cool antique guns, and he took the boys shooting and he taught them all manner of gun safety. And, that Patrick was always super safe with a gun right until he wasn't. So back to the, kind of the academic side, they talk about lived experience. And these are a couple of quotes from Tracy Cross's July seminar. He said, being gifted is being different. This is something Patrick really didn't like. I remember at one point in high school when I was trying to talk him through advocating for himself, I said, honey, it's a gift. It's a blessing. And he's like, no, Mom, that it's a curse. It's really a curse. And so, it's hard to change that, I think, once they get that mindset. And the other really important thing that came out of Tracy's seminar, at least for me, is that it's really important to understand that a person's experience happens between their ears. So, if you look objectively at the set of circumstances that somebody is operating under and feeling suicidal about, it may not seem bad to you, but the reality of what it is to them is really all that matters, because that's their lived experience. And so we need to recognize and acknowledge, that it's as bad as they feel that it is. And so never sort of try to belittle those feelings. It's not the way to go. So again, this is Tracy's slide. You see him in the top corner. I thought this was so good, I wasn't going to try to even recreate it. And in the last over 10 years, I've been working with our gifted center in Jeffco at Wheat Ridge High School, so high school center kids. And we take them on a retreat each fall, and the kids, share around the campfire. And I cannot tell you how many times kids who are in distress talk about feeling like they're in this downward spiral or corkscrew. And I would say, if you don't remember anything else from this, this is the most important slide. So the plane of normal functioning is, we're walking around, we're doing what we're doing, everything's fine, but then things happen and it might be kind of uncomfortable, but we usually find the wherewithal to start walking back up. We go back up. But sometimes, and this is where we don't have the strategies or the protective factors aren't in place, people kind of fall all the way down the crevasse and they see that the only way out is death. And so it's so simple that you're like, duh, but it really is this simple. The protective factors push us back up the corkscrew and the risk factors push us down. And so as parents and caregivers and people just trying to, look out for our own mental health, it's really important to be able to think about where you are on this graphic at any particular point in time. And the thing that comes out of the research, and I can't quote all of the psychologists, but basically hopelessness is the key. And we saw that in the chat with Patrick. At one point, somebody said, well, what's the difference? You've said you were going to do this before. And he said, I was hopeful before. So hopelessness is the thing that we really need to watch out for. Again, this is another of Tracy's slides, and this one really just talks about how the messages we give as parents, as teachers, as counselors impact where people are, or help people move back up the spiral rather than down, and how this might affect us, like gender roles and things like that. So it's, again, it's all what's between your ears, but what's between your ears is based on the messages that you're receiving from others. And so it's important for us to think about the impact that our words have, right? It's actions and words and beliefs. And so, we want to watch the stereotypical things, like you should read more books, or you should get outside and play, or girls don't do that, or boys don't do that. It's not helpful. So this is the first of the models. And really, they're risk factors, basically. So they're biological risk factors. Obviously, there's biological risk of depression. Patrick did not have diagnosed depression. Gender, obviously, and genetics. In my family, there's a lot of autism or autism spectrum on my side of the family. That actually comes into the study as, a concern. The psychological risk factors, self-esteem, depression, that hopelessness comes up again. Cognitive, how are your problem-solving skills? Do you have the skills and ability to march back up the corkscrew? Or will you get stuck in the bottom because of inflexible thinking? What kind of coping strategies do you have? What's your family experience? And I think we were pretty typical family, but we had our typical with the teenage problems too, like not totally agreeing on certain rules and things like that. And so the lack of clarity can become a problem too. And so what I would ask, obviously it's not terribly interactive, but I think that one of the most important things that come out of this is, what can we do? What are the things we can do something about? And so I'm just going to ask you to consider this model. And again, it's in the handout as I sort of go through telling Patrick's story, because I think you'll see a lot of these things are present. So I skipped all the way through elementary and middle school, and that feels really weird, but I think this is a good slide to just kind of summarize where he was. So he was in public school through 5th grade, and he was in a GT center, a pull-out a center program within an elementary school for 4th and 5th grade. And then we moved him to a private school for GT kids because his needs were not being met in middle school. And he had really good experience there. But it was a program that had 8 kids in the senior class, in the 8th grade class. And so then he went on to a very large public high school for an IB program. I'll say no more about IB. But as many of us know, not necessarily the best fit for a gifted visual spatial kid. I guess that's the other thing I haven't really summarized here. He was definitely an experiential learner. His best friend, Evan's mom, was a principal at the outdoor lab program. So they spent tons of times in the mountains and just loved that lifestyle. He had, good grades. He was studying IB, maybe underachieving at that point, but he was all those other things that we've been talking about with these kids. He was very introverted, highly sensitive, emotional, intense, had just a few deep friendships, no girls at this point, and he had taken himself off the ADD meds. And he's young for his class. He's a June birthday. And so we questioned his resiliency at this point and his vote for Pedro shirt. Who remembers those, right? So by his sophomore year, some of these pictures, again, haunt me a little bit. Like, I look at them and I'm like, is this angst? Or is this just typical 15-year-old stuff? He loved his guitar, but he just kind of had a crustiness about him at that point. And we didn't really consider depression at this point. We did the following year. So in his junior year, he was dating a girl at school from like homecoming in the fall until spring break. And then she broke up with him by text message over spring break. And he happened to be up in the mountains with his best friend, Evan, and Evan's family. And Evan's mom was an educator. And even she was surprised at the intense emotional reaction to this breakup. Like, he was physically ill and asked his dad to come pick him up. And at that point, she was breaking up with him to date his other friend at the high school. And at that point, he had no reason to get up and go to school anymore. It was pulling teeth. We finally decided it was time to move him back to his home school rather than where he was, and kind of give him a fresh start for his senior year. And that did turn out to be a good choice, being pretty asynchronous. He was a senior, but his friends were sophomores. And so he was kind of the big guy on campus. He drove a Nissan Xterra, and the other boys didn't drive. And, he was kind of big man about town. And the other plug I always make here is to really consider, especially if your kid's an experiential learner, let them explore the vocational kinds of things to do. We have a fabulous program at Warren Tech here, and I really thought that he would want to do game design, and it was closed. And I was like, well, I'll advocate. I'll try to get you in. He's like, no, I really want to do automotive customization, Mom. I think this will be really cool. So I think it's just important that we recognize how kids learn. So the teacher of this automotive customization program said to me, Patrick taught me how to be a better teacher, because I could tell I was losing him. If I just start talking, I could tell I was losing him. So I would think about, okay, what can I have them do while we're talking so that he could be doing something while we were processing. And it's an important thing. And he always wanted that Chevelle, so had to put that in. So senior year, enter a new girlfriend. She was younger. And as this relationship grew, he kind of pushed some of the other people out a little bit, some of his other guy friends, and some of it was pretty normal, but some of it ended up not being very normal. So by May of 2010, his best friend Evan graduated. Patrick was still a couple classes shy from having imploded his junior year. But these are just this was graduation and the graduation party, and one of my favorite pictures, them on a motorcycle together. They really were best friends, and this is another important lesson. I'm just so honored that he had that kind of soulmate. He said to me at one point when they were little kids, he said, Mommy, sometimes Evie and I don't even need to talk. We just know what the other one's thinking. And we're blessed that Brendan, his little brother, still has a close relationship with Evan, and he's still very much part of our family. So on June 25th of 2010, so just 10 years ago, he turned 18, and we had a cookout, and we had a great time. But that was also the day that he was eligible to buy a gun in the state of Colorado, a long gun. And I'm not going to get on that soapbox, but we'd never had guns in our house. And at this point, he started to buy guns because he was interested in them. So in the fall of his, what would have been his senior year, but he still had some credits to do, he was going to go back to Warren Tech and do a second year in the automotive customization program, but for college credit. It was dual credit. And the teacher changed, and Patrick was totally inflexible. Like, he liked learning from Mr. Bentz, and then this new teacher came in who just talked. Of course, they have to do that with the safety things and stuff, but it just wasn't meeting his needs, and he dropped out. So then I'm like, well, you can't just take one class and, drive around with the girlfriend. You need to look for a job. Well, this was a stressor that I didn't recognize as a mom. After he passed away, his friend Shane told me that he told Shane that he knew how to apply for a job, like to do the online application, but he had no idea still how to go eyeball to eyeball with somebody and ask for a job. And so, these are just the little things you kind of learn after the fact. But had I stopped to think about it, I could have, helped helped him by role playing and things like that, but it just never occurred to me. That fall, my grandmother passed away, and we all flew home, obviously. And as soon as we got there, he decided he wanted to come back to Denver. And I didn't really think much of it. I was actually kind of angry with him because he said he'd be a pallbearer and all those things. But when we look at the model, significant loss is actually one of those things. And so I don't know whether, it was freaking him out that we were there because my grandmother had passed away, or whether he just wanted to get home to his new sports car and an empty house with the girlfriend. We're not sure. But needless to say, he did not attend the funeral. And so there's the rest of the family. I put these in here just because they're some of the last pictures that we have. He did love Christmas. He was meticulous about how he put his ornaments on the tree. But again, I worry about sort of that the way he carried himself suddenly, that looks like depression, I think. So in January, he decided that this relationship that was about 1.5 years in was a bad idea. They broke up, or at least they started to break up. He started classes. He and Evan double teamed 3 classes at the local community college. He was getting all A's, even in a speech class. And as far as we knew, the breakup happened in January. But what we didn't know is that they kept breaking up and getting back together, which I did that in high school too. That's not like something we should be really concerned about. But it became very, very manipulative. And so we had a phone call. This was back in the day when we still had a landline. And we had a phone call one day from the girl, and she said, Patrick and I need to talk to you guys. So we got on the extension, and she never said anything for like 5 minutes. And then like a half an hour later, he comes in the house, and we're like, what's going on? We got this weird phone call. And he's like, I don't know anything about her. I'm not have anything to do with her. She's crazy. And so that was kind of weird, but it was, as it turns out, apparently there had been a positive pregnancy test or a concern with pregnancy. And I think they were going to tell us, but they never did tell us. So as we go into this critical period, he had denied that she was pregnant, and we didn't ask again. We think they broke up for good a few weeks before. We have no clue about a pregnancy or any of that. Our concern is just that he's doing well in school, which he seemed to be doing. He thinks she's pregnant. He continues to try to break up. I found out after the fact, I looked at his phone, and there were text messages where she would convince him to come over in the middle of the night, which he did do. He tries to convince her to give the baby up for adoption. His father's adopted, his little sister's adopted. Like, school's really the last thing on his mind. So we've got this very adult situation. It's the spring break, which I did, or not spring break, but midterms. And so he misses his midterms on Monday. So things are escalating. On Tuesday, he had lost his phone, and he was working with a contractor who was a friend of the family, laying tile, and it was a pretty normal day. And by the end of the, kind of mid-afternoon, it was a beautiful sunny day, kind of the first spring-like day in Colorado, and we decided to go to Dairy Queen and get ice cream. I will say at this point, this really would be the trigger warning. I'm going to go into a fair amount of detail kind of about what happened. What happened that evening was he filled out a job application. He did tell us he was going to quit classes, and I still didn't realize that he had missed his midterms, but I think he knew that. So things were just really, really building. There were about 350 texts between he and the girl in this time period. And so he let her know he had a new phone, and we were actually watching TV, and then it was late, and so we all went to bed. And apparently her mom knew that they had been talking on the phone, or texting back and forth late at night, so she took the charger. So they got on instant messaging, and that's how we have this documented. What started as the girl wanting her iPod back iPod, not iPad, just a little phone, little music device, quickly turned into escalating, talking about suicide. It was very clear that they had talked about suicide before, which was all unbeknownst to us. And obviously this is happening in the basement of our house and we have no idea. That's my other hint, is if you have any concerns, get them in a place where you can hear what's going on. So he says in the chat, I have to kill myself. And then they go through this process of, she says, well, how will people know what you want me to have? Which was very thoughtful of her, if you ask me. And so she convinces him to write a will. He uses his computer, researches the language, writes his will, leaves his music to Evan, his guns to Stephen, his shooting partner, and everything else to her. So, and then at some point, they're saying goodbye. And again, it's all the typical stuff that I did, breaking up with the first boyfriend. I wish we could go back to when things were wonderful and blah, blah, blah. And so, but like, you can't tell because it's not timestamped, but he's going to complete suicide. And then he comes back and he types to her, that's it. You're not even going to try to stop me. It's a classic cry for help. And she responds with, everyone I've ever told about you doing it says that you're not going to do it, everyone. And he says, like who? And she names names. She names all of his friends by name. And then he says, well, I guess I'm going to have to prove them wrong. And he typed the letter K when she said she didn't believe him one more time. And he completed suicide at 18. I don't put this here to be morbid. I have talked a lot with educators, and I just think that this is a really important thing to say. If you're, if you have a child who completes suicide or a sibling of a child completes suicide, it was so important for my other kids to be supported by their teachers, their principals, counselors. We just had way more of a turnout than we ever expected. And the boys gave the eulogy. So that's my son, Brendan, and his best friend, Evan. And the crazy green ties are because my husband's Irish. And so since he completed suicide on the 13th of March, we had a very, very green funeral. So you see the girls all wore green dresses. And these are his friends, the boys up here, and they're all still in our lives. Which has been a real blessing for everybody involved. We had a balloon launch. It was sort of a gray, yucky day. So back to this model. Based on his story, how many of these risk factors are present? Like every single one of them, right? Poor coping strategies, presence of deadly weapon. I just can't say this one enough. Like if you have concerns, remove means. Like this, I really believe that if he'd had the gun, which, he bought, and we had discussions, I didn't want guns in my house. If he'd had to keep those down the street at his friend Steven's and his face hit the cold air at 3:00 in the morning, I think he would have been like, what the hell am I doing? This is stupid. But he was caught up in that moment. He was in the bottom of that spiral. So these are the suicide trajectory model. And then this is the timeline. I know it's really hard to see, but again, it's in your handout, and I don't want to get too caught up with it, but I just want to make sure people are aware of it because, again, it does show all the medications and those kinds of things. So what do we do about this? How can we protect them? And I think this is some of the really cool work that has come out of the PA and the research that Dr. Cross and others are doing. So this is, the source here is White, Preventing Youth Suicide, a guide for practitioners, and it comes out of Canada, and it was developed, there's some pieces of this that were specific to Native Canadian Indian tribe, because I think maybe they did some of the funding. But basically what the Crosses have done is they've taken this group of factors. So you've got your predisposing factors, these are things that lead you toward possibly this being, a challenge for you. Contributing factors, And again, you kind of see we were checking every box that particular week. Precipitating factors, so loss, personal failure, he'd blown his tests. My grandmother had died. He didn't really have peer victimization, though he had pushed himself away from his friend group in that time frame. Never really had conflict with the law or incarceration. And then, I would like to think that we had all the protective factors in place, though his success in school was questionable. And supportive school climate, the researchers, having looked at all the details there, said it was supportive in the private middle school, but not in the public schools, despite our best efforts. So the other piece of work that they've done lately is to take some of those factors from the prior page and look at what's specific about GT kids. And the Crosses use students with gifts and talents. That's what the SWGT is. And so, they're saying the things that are predisposing factors, they're things that we can do something about. Untrained teachers is a problem. So we should have trained teachers, and we should have adequate curriculum, and we should have adequate social and emotional supports, and we shouldn't have boring stuff. So again, these are the model helps us identify where gifted kids might be more at risk than their neurotypical peers with regard to suicidal ideation and risk. Okay. And I will say the study has actually takes it a step past this and actually says what they thought was prevalent in Patrick, but it's such small font and we just don't have the time to go into all that detail. And I'd even argue some of it, but at any rate. So what can we do? Keep an eye out. And again, this quote comes from Tracy last month. He said, if you're concerned about a kid, do something. There's really nothing you can do that's going to make it worse. If you have a concern, reach out, ask them the question, are you thinking about hurting yourself? Have that conversation and be ready to take action. And obviously we need to change the climate about suicide. This is particularly concerning in these times. Some of the early data, I know our Safe to Tell program here in Jeffco has seen something like a 30% increase just during the pandemic of kids calling in on other kids. And that's when they're not even necessarily seeing each other. This is just behavior that they're seeing on Facebook, or probably not Facebook in this case, but kids who are at risk are very potentially at higher risk during these times of isolation. And then dispel the myths, and the two that Tracy calls out are once suicidal, always suicidal. Never give up on somebody. I've never, again, this wasn't Patrick by any stretch, but if somebody just seems like they're going to do it no matter what, like, don't believe that. Just keep working it with them. And the other huge myth out there is that if you mention suicide, you're somehow planting a seed and that they're going to be more likely to complete. That is absolutely not true. If anything else, it takes the air out of the room, and they'll talk about it, and potentially that's the first step, right? It's question and refer, question, persuade, and refer. So these are some of the things that we can do. And again, think about where the person that you love is in that spiral at any particular time. So here's sort of the hodgepodge of all of those factors that we've talked about. So the biological factors, and then you've got the risk protective factors, all feeding into that lived experience, and then life events, so that we help people walk back up the corkscrew rather than falling down. And again, I will tell you, I have heard at least 10 high school kids talk about this very thing without, to my knowledge, them ever being exposed to it. Like, it's just the way they feel. And it's very important to recognize that the closer you get to the bottom, the more constricted it is, right? And the faster you're spinning down, so you lose momentum, right? But I think that there's really something to this, because when I've heard kids talk who say they had suicidal ideation and got through it. They don't use these words, but they definitely talk about the feeling of being in that spiral. So these are, again, from the seminar, and I've heard Tracy say this in other places too. One other thing I would point you to is about this time last year, he did a Mind Matters podcast that talked about suicide among the gifted, and it was when the study, the psychological autopsy, was in review, in publication. And he specifically said at the end of that podcast that he said, I can't prove it with the data, because there really isn't data about this. He said, but it's my very strong feeling after hearing several of these stories and having the research that we have, that while gifted kids' prevalence rate might not be higher, in fact, he thinks it might be lower, but they definitely seem to complete with fewer attempts. So in Patrick's case, again, he had that computer in his basement bedroom, and he had gone online to see how to place the gun. So it worked. So, their intelligence can be a challenge in this regard. Have humility and stay engaged. I will be the first to say, he was trying our patience sometimes. He was, all the things that we've talked about these kids. He was stubborn. He was, he had smart language. He, and I think we did mostly stay engaged, but obviously he wasn't feeling like he could talk to us about it, because we never heard him talk about suicide. The only two people that I'm aware of he talked about suicide with were the girlfriend, and that really felt like a lot of manipulation to me. At least that night where I have the language, and I didn't see anything in the chats. I mean, in the text messages, just in the chat. But it was clear that it had happened before. And then Evan did share that they had sort of existential conversations about suicide being a legitimate option, pre-high school. And he did reach out to Evan the night he passed, but he knew Evan was getting a new phone. So I just I can't quite explain it. The other thing is males have fewer attempts to completion because they're more likely to use guns, and half of completed suicides are by gun. So I'll go quickly through this because I do want to be able to take questions. I know this is kind of heavy, but we got through it. And this was the first birthday without him, just 3 months after he died, and all of his friends showed up. And they still do, and that's been good. These are the questions, that you would ask. Are you feeling suicidal? And then if they say they do, you ask, do you have a plan? And the more detail they have, the more concern you should have. And then at least in Colorado or in Jeffco, the protocol that we're using is QPR, which is question, persuade, and refer. And we never got that far, but definitely have a plan. I will say, when I first started working on this, a colleague of mine from Oracle reached out to me to say that she had hospitalized her 7-year-old son. So this is real. The other thing is try to get a no harm contract, get rid of all means, and don't leave them alone. This is the high point. Just after the year after Patrick died, again, I was very active in our local affiliate in Jefferson County, and a group of my friends from there gifted me $600, and I gave small scholarships to his 4 friends who were graduating in 2012. So like I said, they were 2 years younger than him. And then after that, when I finally was ready to engage around gifted again, my work has been in the Wheat Ridge High School GT Center program here in Jeffco. And so each year I raise funds and give scholarships to seniors in that program. And what they have to do to be eligible is to either write an essay or, do something. I've had people do recordings and stuff that talks about resilience, because for me, that's what he lacked. And I'm still not, sure exactly all the things I could have done to fix that. But I know that GT Center program does really help them build resilience. And I think it's important for kids to reflect on where they were as freshmen and where they are as they get a little bit older. And so there's our 2020 grads that had their ceremony, just this weekend. And I will leave it with that. The handout does have the references, but that's my contact information. And I'd open it up to questions now if anybody has any questions.
Right. Thanks, Terry. And folks, if you have questions, throw them in the chat room. We got about 9 minutes.
I know so I did this presentation, I guess it's about 1.5 years ago now, to about 150 counselors. Mm-hmm. And it was like crickets. And I was like, did they not hear me or what? And somebody came up afterwards and she said, you have to understand, we go into counselor mode. Like, we go into trying to figure out what happened here. So it's not that we didn't hear you. It's just that we're like processing. And it's tough stuff. It really is. I understand that.
Carrie says, thank you for your transparency. I truly appreciate hearing your story. Sharina says, thank you for your presentation. Jan, thank you so much for sharing.
Great. And this is, I think we know this is a safe community. That was the other thing for me is, you don't do this one at the PTA. It doesn't, they don't want to hear those things. But no, I feel like if we can do anything to help people see that spark and ask that one question, then it's really all worth it. The other plug I'll make, since we just have a minute to burn, is every time I've heard Tracy talk about this, he's like, please, if you have interest in this, reach out to me. They're really concerned that when they retire, there's really nobody to pick up the mantle and keep doing this work. I mean, when you think about 5 years, it wasn't all they were doing, but this is intensive academic research. And it's feeding into how can we do a better job of identifying these kids. In fact, Jennifer Cross was telling me that they've actually been pulled into helping the counseling group at William and Mary do a better job of doing training on suicide prevention. And they're using a model out of SPRC that Syracuse University is using. So I don't really know a whole lot about that other than it's promoted as experiential. And what Jennifer told me is the really powerful thing is that it has a component of practicing asking those questions so that you don't just like read your little QPR book and go, okay, got it. Because when it really happens and you're really called to try to intervene with somebody, it happened to me last week for whatever reason, people call me. And I found myself sort of grabbing for that little QPR book, and I was helping somebody who was trying to help her son, and she wasn't in a very good place either. And it's scary. Mm-hmm. I'll just say it. It's scary. Well, but do something, as Tracy says, do something. Don't just let it go, because you never know if that's the action that's going to be the thing that helps save a life.
As a former educator and also administrator, Terry, one of effective way to reach out to schools might be, and I found this to be effective. Usually staff meetings are half an hour long in the morning or in the afternoon. If you can compact the information, a 10 to 15 minute presentation, principals might be willing to show it to a staff meeting just to get their teachers on board. So that might be something to think about. But that's what I used to do.
That.
I would have my staff meetings, and then I'd have either someone come in or do a presentation very quickly, and then we'd get to our other stuff. So that might, because time is of the essence, as you know.
Absolutely. And like I said, it's really concerning because, I mean, it's just common sense. If people are isolated, if people were already a little on the cusp, then those people are more vulnerable right now, Jan
asked the question, I have a few high school students that have ideation. What is the best way to help them, talk to the parent? What percentage of high school students have ideation? Probably referring to gifted.
Yeah. So again, if you go back to that first slide, according to Tracy, a lot of people have ideation. I think that, again, I'm not an educator, but what we've found, I've worked very closely with the 2 lead teachers at the Wheat Ridge Center. And what happened there is it started out as a very small program, but now it's up to about 170 kids, and it's, they have like a special class. So they only knew the kids in there, the 30 kids in their block. They didn't know the other 120. And so a few years ago, we started taking them for a retreat in the mountains for a couple of days. And it actually came out of the kids. I mean, one of the students, her activity was for them to each write something that they wanted to release on a Post-it note, and then we had a bonfire, and they would throw it in the fire, and if they wanted to talk about it, they could talk about it. It's hard for me to even tell you the level of transparency and honesty and emotion that pours out of these kids when they know they're in a safe space with other kids who have shared concerns. And somebody would stand up and, talk about suicidal ideation or being abused or whatever. And as soon as they broke into tears, a scrum of kids would come around and hug them. Now, I don't know how we're going to do this with COVID, but I think the key there is that safe space, right? And that the adults show their transparency and their willingness to talk about hard things. These 2 lead teachers is Lisa Lee and Elliot Holm at Wheat Ridge High School. Huge shout out, because they are the social emotional support for 170 kids, in addition to, the teaching part, but they are the trusted adult in the room. That was one thing I really tried to do with Patrick when things were falling apart at Littleton High School, is I asked his counselor to be that trusted adult, to let him be a runner for him, kind of give him a half a credit or whatever, because I just wanted him to have to go eyeball to eyeball every day. So that level of trust is just so important. And a lot of these kids don't have it at home. Some of us are very privileged, and we don't realize how privileged we are until we hear some of these other stories about with these kids, school's the safest place they've ever been. So that's how I would answer that one, is you got to give some of yourself.
Excellent. Thank you, Terry, so much for your time. Thank you, folks, for attending. And I'm going to have you log off now so the next presenter can jump in.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Stay safe out there.
Absolutely. I'll see you later.
Bye-bye.